Hello students, this is Professor McDermott with the last and final video lecture of our course. The topic is Reconstruction. So after the southern states seceded, launching the Civil War, and after the Civil War was won by the North, those southern states had to be reintegrated or readmitted into the United States, and that process is what we call Reconstruction. But it was a very contentious process. There were many differences of opinion as to how this should be done. Actually, the process began even before the war ended, while Lincoln was still president. And Lincoln really wanted to take a very easy, very lenient approach to reconstructing the South. Partly because, in Lincoln's mind, it was illegal or impossible for a state to secede from the Union. And so he really believed that the southern states had never really left the United States. And so he wanted to set up the most minimal standards for the southern states to come back. So, for example, Louisiana, even during Lincoln's lifetime, he allowed it to come back into the United States after 10% of the registered voters in that state swore an oath of loyalty to the Union. And that was the standard that he wanted to set. It was a very low, very easy standard. Only 10% of the voters had to swear loyalty to the United States. After Lincoln was assassinated, the new president was President Andrew Johnson. Johnson's an interesting character. He was actually a tailor. He made men's clothes. He lived in a place called Greenville, Tennessee. He was a slaveholder. Before the war, he had about 10 slaves. And when the war started, though, he proclaimed his loyalty to the Union, and he actually did free his slaves. But he always had, to some extent, that mentality of the Southern white slaveholder, and that really showed in his policies. By the way, my first job when I got out of grad school was teaching at Tusculum College in Greenville, Tennessee, the home of President Andrew Johnson. And I had to really watch what I said about him because, in my opinion, he was the worst president in American history. But people there were very proud of him, so I couldn't exactly come out and say that without making everyone mad. Anyway, Johnson, in his policy of presidential reconstruction, went even farther than Lincoln and really bent over backwards to make it easy for the southern states. He was a great believer in states' rights, and essentially he wanted things to get back to the way they were more or less before the war in the southern states. So, for example, he issued thousands of pardons to former Confederates, military commanders, Confederate politicians, and that meant they were allowed to vote and run for office. So pretty soon you saw that the same people were running these southern states that had been running it during the Civil War, during the Confederacy. Also, Johnson allowed the southern states to pass what were known as the Black Codes. What were the Black Codes? Well, they were a series of laws passed in some of the southern states that were reconstructed by Lincoln and Johnson between the years 1865 and 1866. And the law codes varied from state to state, but here are some of the features that you see in them. First of all, the Black Codes did acknowledge that slavery had come to an end. So African Americans, all African Americans were now free, and they also allowed the ex-slaves, the freed people, to hold property and also to get married legally for the first time. And that was important because during the slavery time, of course, um, slaves did get married, but it wasn't a legal marriage. They didn't have a marriage license and so forth. The reason for that was, of course, that the slave owners wanted to have the freedom to break up married couples. A lot of times they would sell the husband or the wife to someone else, and if those marriages, those slave marriages, had been legal, they might have been prevented from doing that. And so during the slavery time, African Americans basically had to invent their own marriage ceremonies. One very popular one was to jump over a broomstick, and I understand that some couples even today do this as a tribute to their ancestors. This was a popular procedure for marriage during the time when African Americans could not marry legally, at least slaves couldn't. Now, so African Americans now were allowed to marry legally, but only other African Americans, not white people, under the black codes. Also, the black codes allowed African Americans to sue other people in court. But that was the limit of the liberties that were given to African Americans under the black codes. There were many limitations placed on their lives. For example, some of the black codes said that African Americans were not allowed to travel more than a few miles from the place where they lived. Now, that was a serious hardship for the newly freed slaves because for many of them, the first order of business was actually to hit the road and start looking for their long-lost relatives who had been sold to faraway places, away from them. You know, their wives, their mothers, their husbands, their fathers, their children, brothers and sisters. There was a real desire to reunite those families, and if you look at newspapers during this period, you see these very poignant advertisements describing relatives who they had been separated from. And so African Americans really wanted that freedom to travel so that they could find their relatives, but that was denied to them by these black codes. Also, the black codes prohibited free assembly by African Americans, so they couldn't, for example, have a political demonstration or even a public political meeting. They were denied the right to bear arms, to bear weapons, under most of the black codes. Also, African Americans under the black codes generally were not allowed to testify in court. They were not allowed to vote, and they were not allowed to serve on juries. And that really undermined the freedom they were given to sue people in court, because after all, how were you going to win a lawsuit if you or your friends or your relatives couldn't testify on your behalf? So that really meant that there was no equal protection of the law for African Americans in the southern states under the black codes. Three of the southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, went even farther. And their goal was to basically recreate the old plantation system of organizing labor in the South. And so those three states actually forced the newly freed slaves to work on plantations, like they always had. It forced them to sign contracts committing them to work there year by year. Now, they were paid, but essentially they had no choice. They were made to continue working on the plantation under these contracts, and in many cases their children were also forced to work. The children were called apprentices, but really what you have here is a system of essentially slave labor. And if you look at these provisions of these three states, you may wonder, what had really changed. It really seemed like nothing had changed from the slavery time for African Americans. Fortunately for African Americans in the South, there were a large number of representatives and senators in Congress who belonged to the radical wing of the Republican Party, what we call the Radical Republicans. And the Radical Republicans really went against President Johnson because they wanted to try to help African Americans in the South, and especially to guarantee them their legal rights. And so the Radical Republicans in 1866 in Congress passed the first great Civil Rights Act in American history. And the first thing the act said was that all the black codes in those southern states would be abolished. So all of those discriminatory rules and procedures would be eliminated, and African Americans would be guaranteed equality before the law. The Civil Rights Act did not go so far as to mandate that black males should be given the right to vote. It left that decision up to the state, but in other respects, it did greatly improve the situations of African Americans in the South. President Andrew Johnson, of course, vetoed the bill. And in his veto message, he said, quote, "It is another step towards centralization and the concentration of all legislative powers in the national government," end quote. In other words, you know, we talked in the Civil War lecture about how President Lincoln had centralized the federal government quite a bit in many ways. That's why some people thought, one reason why some people thought he was a tyrant, because under Lincoln the federal national government had gotten so much more powerful. Well, Johnson is saying now, look, that was fine during the war, but now we're going to get back to the usual state of affairs and the way we do business, and that means the states will once again have the most power. However, as you probably know, in the Constitution it says that when a president vetoes a bill, it then goes back to Congress, and Congress can override the veto if both houses of Congress pass the law again by a 2/3 majority. And that's exactly what happened on April 9th, 1866. The House and the Senate repassed the Civil Rights Act, and it did become law, one of the very few cases in American history where Congress overrode a presidential veto. And furthermore, Congress was instrumental in passing three important amendments to the Constitution, which were then ratified by the states, that dramatically changed life for African Americans, the three post-Civil War amendments. The first was the 13th Amendment, which of course abolished slavery. If any of you have ever seen the movie Lincoln, came out several years ago starring Daniel Day-Lewis as Abraham Lincoln, it's worth a view. Basically, the film is all about how Lincoln twisted arms and used every means he could to persuade Congress to pass the 13th Amendment shortly before his death. When that amendment was ratified by the states, slavery was officially abolished. The next amendment was the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868. This is arguably the most important of all constitutional amendments. It accomplished several things. First of all, it said that anyone who is born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, period. Doesn't matter what race you are, what religion. If you're born here, you're a citizen of the U.S. President Trump, as I record this in 2020, recently has suggested that this part of the 14th Amendment should be repealed because he doesn't think the children of illegal immigrants should become American citizens simply because they were born here, since their parents were here illegally. So part of this amendment has been questioned, but it is still the law of the land that if you're born in the U.S., you are a citizen of the U.S. This was the first national definition of citizenship. Previously, the states had decided who was a citizen. It also said that none of the states were allowed to deprive their residents of, quote, life, liberty, or property without due process of law, end quote. Now, you may recall that life, liberty, and property are what we call natural rights. Natural rights which were believed to come from God and therefore could not be taken away by government. But the Bill of Rights had said only that Congress could not deprive people of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Um, and the 14th Amendment said now that the states also were prohibited from depriving people of their natural rights unless there was a legal procedure. So the loophole here is that if you commit a crime and you are found guilty of committing a crime, then of course the state or the federal government can deprive you of your liberty, they can send you to jail, they can deprive you of your property, they can fine you, and in some cases even you might get the death penalty, you might be even deprived of your life because there has been a legal procedure showing that you committed a crime. There was recently a documentary on Netflix, I think, called 14th, talking about this loophole in the 14th Amendment as an excuse for mass incarceration of blacks and a form of new slavery in contemporary America. That too is worth a look if you get a chance to see it. Well, anyway, the 14th Amendment then began the process by which the Bill of Rights protections became applied to the states as well as the federal government. And that would become very, very significant in American history. Andrew Johnson, of course, was against the 14th Amendment, but it was passed over his opposition in 1868. Finally, the 15th Amendment of 1870 was quite controversial because it allowed African American males to vote, not African American women and not white women throughout the U.S. And that really caused a lot of anger among white feminists, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, because you may recall that many of them had been part of the anti-slavery movement. They had supported black civil rights for a long time, and they felt betrayed because African American men got the vote before them, white feminist women. And there were actually a lot of very unfortunate racist comments made by some of those leaders at that time. How dare they give these illiterate, ignorant Negroes the right to vote before I, civilized, educated, upstanding white woman get the right to vote, and so forth. So it caused a real split between the African American civil rights leaders and the feminist leaders that really wasn't repaired until after World War I, when women finally got the right to vote by congressional amendment throughout the country. Well, so what we see here is that by this time Congress has firmly taken over the process of Reconstruction. They've taken it out of President Johnson's hands, and they've adopted totally new policies. Andrew Johnson, of course, didn't like that, and he decided to appeal directly to the voters. There was, in 1866, a congressional election going on, and Johnson really wanted the voters to elect more moderate Republicans who would be sympathetic with his approach. And so he decided to do something very unprecedented. He got on a train and he made a big sweeping circle around the country. He started in Washington, he went to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Louisville, all around the country by train, making a big circle. So this trip is known as the Swing Around the Circle, made by President Andrew Johnson in 1866. It was unusual because at that point in history it was very rare for a president to actually make political speeches on his own behalf. Presidents and even presidential candidates were supposed to be more or less quiet and let other people speak for them. It was considered to be in bad taste for the president to do something like this. But Johnson really decided to break that precedent, and so he made his swing around the circle. However, there was a real backlash against this. His speeches were very fiery, very angry, very bombastic, and people really thought it was beneath the president's dignity to behave like Johnson had done in the swing around the circle. And so, as it turned out in the 1866 elections, even more radical Republicans who opposed Johnson's policies were elected. And that meant that Congress was now totally in control of Reconstruction, and it enabled them in 1867 to completely overhaul the plan for Reconstruction and start from scratch. Basically, they said all the states that were reconstructed up to now have to apply again to rejoin the Union. And before we will let them come back, they have to write a new state constitution that does two things. It allows black males to vote, and it also ratifies the 14th Amendment. And so it was a new, much tougher policy towards the southern states that was designed to protect black civil rights. By 1868, the hatred between Johnson and the other members of his own party, the Republican Party in Congress, had reached the point that the House of Representatives actually impeached President Andrew Johnson, accused him of high crimes and misdemeanors, and indicted him. Now, Johnson was the first of three presidents to be impeached in American history. The second was President Bill Clinton, and the third, as I'm sure you know, was President Donald Trump. And in all three cases, the result was the same, because after the House impeaches a president, the process doesn't stop there. At that point, the case goes into the Senate, and the Senate has to hold a trial with witnesses and evidence. And then the Senate takes a vote, almost like they were a trial jury, on whether to find the president guilty or not guilty of those articles of impeachment. And in all three cases, for Johnson, Clinton, and Trump, the Senate found them not guilty, and they were allowed to continue in office. However, in Johnson's case, the vote was very close. On one of the articles of impeachment, the margin was 1, so if even one senator had changed his vote, Johnson would have been convicted and removed from office. But as it was, he survived by the skin of his teeth and was able to finish out his term. I want to talk about a very important department of the federal government that really had a huge impact on the lives of African Americans during Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was in existence from 1865 to 1872. The Freedmen's Bureau did many things. The goal of this agency was to help the newly freed slaves to adjust to life as free people. And you can imagine what a challenge that was for them. First of all, nearly all of them were illiterate. It had been illegal for slaves to learn to read and write. They had never had any experience, for example, with having a bank account or conducting their own affairs in any sense. And so there were so many decisions that had to be made, so much practical knowledge that the freed people had to acquire simply in order to survive, and the Freedmen's Bureau helped with that. They built hospitals so that the freed people could get better medical care, but especially they built schools, and teachers came from the north and then increasingly trained Southerners to also become teachers in these schools. Education was a huge priority for the newly freed slaves. They understood that knowledge is power, and that the slaveholders had essentially been in a conspiracy to keep them in ignorance for many years. And if they wanted to be truly free people, they had to acquire knowledge. And so it was a high priority for them, especially to learn how to read and write. And many men, women, and children, former slaves, flocked into these schools and did did learn reading, writing, and the basics of arithmetic, um, so that they could cope better with life as free people and actually become citizens of the country for the first time officially. Um, Another very important role that was taken up by the Freedmen's Bureau was the creation of a new system of organizing labor in the South. And as soon as the war ended, this became a live issue. How will the work of the South get done in this new situation without slavery? Um, the first step in this decision-making process was taken by General William Tecumseh Sherman, who had famously marched through Georgia in 1864, introducing the policy of total war to the world, essentially. Well, after the war, Sherman became the military governor of the Sea Islands on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. And Sherman began to confiscate land from former Confederates, soldiers, and leaders, and to give that land to the newly freed African Americans. So he would give each family 40 acres of land plus a mule to help them to do the farm work. And this became known as the 40 acres and a mule policy. And it really symbolized everything that African Americans wanted. They wanted to own their own land. They understood that that was a key to independence and true freedom. And so Sherman, for a while, was able to gratify that for at least some African Americans. However, President Andrew Johnson, of course, didn't agree with this policy, and he ordered Sherman, as the commander-in-chief, to take that land back from its new black owners and give it back to the original white owners. And so the 40 acres and a mule policy really did not last long. So African Americans really wanted their own land. White landowners, of course, wanted to keep control of the land. They knew that if they were going to keep their control of society, that maintaining control of the land would be really important for that. And so there was a dilemma, and neither side really wanted to give in until the Freedmen's Bureau stepped in and worked out a compromise. And the compromise approach they worked out is known as sharecropping. Okay? And many of you may have sharecroppers in your ancestry. I do. My grandparents were actually sharecroppers in Kentucky as tobacco farmers in western Kentucky before they were eventually able to get their own farm. They were sharecroppers for a while as well. And so this system of labor came to include many white Southerners as well as African Americans, but it was created essentially for the ex-slaves. Here's how it worked. The white landowners kept their ownership of the land, but instead of having African Americans work on the whole plantation altogether like they did in the slavery time, the white landowners would parcel out individual plots of land to different African American families who would work the land paying rent, and they paid rent in the form of normally 50% of their crops. So at the end of the harvest season, let's say you were a sharecropper growing cotton, you would give half of your cotton crop to the white landowner, and you would keep the other half and you would sell it to meet your family's needs. That was sharecropping. Okay. There were advantages and disadvantages to sharecropping for African Americans. Obviously, it wasn't what they really wanted. They would have preferred to own their own land. And furthermore, in many cases, sharecroppers were forced to buy seeds and other supplies from their landowners, and so they would get deep in debt to the landowners and essentially get tied to the land and were unable to leave because they were so deep in debt. On the other hand, the advantage was that It was no longer a plantation type situation with the gang labor. You didn't have an overseer breathing down your neck. You did have a plot of land which you could live on relatively free, I mean, with less supervision anyway than you had had during the slavery time. It also meant that women didn't necessarily have to work all the time in the fields. Now, they did work very hard, but they were freed up somewhat to keep house and to take care of their children. And that, for many black women, was a very liberating prospect, because during slavery, of course, they had worked in the fields just as hard as the men had. And so for them to at least be able to spend some time in the home as homemakers was a real step forward. And so it was a compromise that neither side really was totally happy with, but it basically worked, and it did become the prevalent way of organizing labor in the South for many years after that. Well, after black males got the vote in 1870, and after the passage of the 14th Amendment, which helped to protect black voting rights, African Americans really made tremendous, almost unbelievable political progress in a very short time. And there were actually numerous African American public officials elected at the local, state, and even federal level. There were a number of black congressmen, and there were even two African American senators in the United States Senate, both of them from Mississippi. The first, Senator Hiram Revels, and the second, Senator Blanche K. Bruce. So this was really extraordinary. At one point, the legislature of South Carolina during Reconstruction actually was majority African Americans, something that would have been utterly unthinkable just a few years earlier. Now, of course, it should be said that all of these African American elected officials were members of the Republican Party. Because, after all, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, was the radical Republicans who really were the only people that cared about black civil rights. The Democratic Party at this point in history was the point of white supremacy and racism. And so all of these lawmakers elected from the African American community were Republicans. But there was a major backlash against this turn of events among the white Southern population. Obviously, most white Southerners really resented that their political privileges had been taken away from them. They felt as if their governments in the South had been stolen from them and taken over by the quote-unquote black Republicans under this black Reconstruction, as they called it. And they really felt like their homeland had been taken over by a hostile power, Yankees, what were called carpetbaggers, coming down from the north with their little suitcases, carpet bags, taking over the government that they felt rightly belonged to them. And so white supremacists began to spread stories about African American legislatures. There were very negative stereotypes about them. You see in the political cartoon on the right, this was from a national magazine called Harper's Weekly. And you see the racist stereotypes that are being perpetuated here. These African American politicians are being portrayed as very angry, uncivilized, rude, and totally unfit to serve as political leaders. And so the backlash among white Southerners took the form of a powerful political movement, the movement that they called redemption. They wanted to redeem the South, as they saw it, and to take it back from the control of the black Republicans to reestablish white supremacy under the leadership of the white supremacist party of that time, the Democratic Party. And ultimately, this move towards redemption was successful throughout the South. And partly that was because the Republican Party had really been lulled into a false sense of security by this point in time. With the passage of the 15th Amendment, in a sense, the Republicans felt like they had achieved all their goals. They really believed that black voting rights were secure, black civil rights were secure, and in a sense, they kind of let down their guard and allowed the Southern Democrats to make a big comeback. What methods did the Democratic Party use in its efforts to reestablish white supremacy? Well, they tried to persuade white voters that white supremacy was in their best interest. But they also forced black voters, in many cases, either not to vote or sometimes even intimidated them or bribed them into voting for the Democratic Party. And in applying force and threats and intimidation to black voters, the key group in that process was, of course, the Ku Klux Klan, a paramilitary terrorist group that was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in May 1866. And the Klan actually has been through three different versions in American history. You see the Klansmen on the left with their creepy uniforms, in which they were essentially trying to look like ghosts or supernatural beings in an attempt to terrorize and intimidate African Americans who they believed were superstitious or more fearful than white people. They would ride into African American communities. They would beat up or murder or lynch black voters, especially, and tried to keep them from voting for the Republican Party, and in some cases force them to vote for the Democratic Party. They also targeted the small group of Southern whites who had joined the Republican Party and were actually sympathetic to black civil rights. These people in the South were known as scallywags. You may have heard old people use that term. But actually it comes from this period of Reconstruction. A scallywag was a white Southerner who was a member of the Republican Party, who supported African Americans. All of the readings that we're going to have for the CPA on Reconstruction have to do with Klan activity, and the different groups will, each of them will have a witness who was a victim of the Klan. These documents are basically witness statements that these people testified before Congress, before congressional hearings investigating the Klan during the 1870s. So you'll learn more about that from those documents. Here's one example of Klan terrorism. In 1870 in South Carolina, the Republicans won a local election, after which the Klan rode in and murdered 13 black Republican voters. So President Grant did suppress the Klan, and it went underground for many years. It was refounded actually in Georgia in 1915, and then it died out at the beginning of the Great Depression in 1929. And then the current Klan, which we unfortunately still have with us, is really the third Klan. It was it came back to life during the 50s as a response to the civil rights movement. Well, anyway, with the help of the Klan, by 1871, the Democratic Party had redeemed or taken back the state governments of 4 southern states. And eventually, they did reestablish white supremacist governments throughout the South, leading to the passage of the laws that we call Jim Crow, establishing the segregation system, depriving blacks of voting rights, and so forth. But that would really take us beyond the time limit for this course. All right, here we are, last slide of the course. How did Reconstruction come to an end? Well, the president after Andrew Johnson was Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero of the North during the Civil War. Even though Grant was a very great general, he wasn't that great of a president. He didn't pick very good employees in the executive branch. Many of the people he appointed to office were corrupt. There were a lot of scandals during the Grant administration. And in 1876, after serving 2 terms, Grant decided to step down, and he actually took the unusual step of writing a letter to Congress apologizing to them for having been such a lousy president. and then he retired. In the election of that year, the Democratic candidate was Samuel Tilden, and the Republican candidate was Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. Now, this was one of those presidential elections where the person who won the most popular vote did not wind up winning the election. Tilden, as you can see on the chart there on the left, got 51% of the vote. So he actually got more popular votes. However, 3 of the states that you see there on the map, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, had a disputed vote count in their states, and none of those 3 states could determine which man had actually won the electoral votes from those states. And so neither man won a majority in the Electoral College, and of course, as you know, that meant that the election went into the House of Representatives, and a congressional committee was created to try to determine who was the winner of the election. And at this point, the Republicans approached the Democrats, and the Democrats were very responsive to the deal that the Republicans offered them. And this was the deal. The Congressional Committee would award the disputed electoral votes to Hayes, and Hayes, the Republican, would become president. In return, Hayes would remove all federal troops from the South. Now, that would mean, of course, that blacks would essentially be defenseless as the Democratic Party rose back to power in the South. Black voters could be deprived of their right to vote. Blacks would be deprived of their equal protection of the laws because it was really the federal troops, the military, that had been protecting those rights. So this is what happened, though. Hayes got into the White House, and ever after he was known as Rutherford B. Hayes because of the corrupt way that he had gotten to be president. And he immediately removed all federal troops from the South. That was the end of Reconstruction, and it opened the way for all of the oppressive and discriminatory laws that would come later. But again, that takes us beyond the limits of the course. But the takeaway here is that the Republican Party sold out their African American supporters in the South for the sake of winning the White House, and that would turn out to be a tragedy for African Americans in the South, who would lose a lot of the gains, the tremendous and incredible, very impressive gains they had made during this period of Reconstruction.